in Memphis. I know, some of you may have seen some of this before. I almost feel like we need like a lead-in song of it's all about the money, money. Um, I'm not a singer, but we're going to talk about funding mechanisms for stormwater management for Tennessee. What are our options? I've presented a version of this at the TNSA conference last year and the State Association of Floodplain Managers. I am a licensed professional engineer in the state, a certified floodplain manager, and a GIS professional. But a key component of much of my work is thinking about resilience and how we can do that better. So given that, also think about kind of the flood side as well as water quality. You're going to see some of that come out throughout the discussion today. So ultimately, several years ago, this is about kind of a summary of a project we did and some takeaways. We wrapped up the project at the end of last year, but really thinking about how we're starting to see more precipitation. These intense, short duration storm events keep happening and hitting our state, atmospheric rivers, and different things like that. But we also have increased development, population growth, encroachment on, buffers and, other natural systems that are meant to help store water or slow down water from storm events. And we have more, stringent water quality regulations that are coming down from the EPA. There's a lot of things happening right now in the stormwater space, also in the flooding space. And so we need to start thinking more proactively instead of reactively. But how do we do that? Because the reality is we need funding. If you want to do stormwater projects, flood management projects, or flood mitigation projects, you have to have money, resources, staff, and it takes kind of a holistic approach to address some of these issues. So ultimately, all these things are coming together. We're starting to see nuisance flooding in areas that are not adjacent to water bodies. We're starting to see flooding in low-lying areas that are in urban spaces, and also water quality management challenges with the increased runoff. We're tracking more things like harmful algal blooms and microplastics and PFAS. So there's just a lot going on. But ultimately, there are some mechanisms through funding that we can use to tackle, both the flooding side, the amount and quantity of water, as well as addressing some of the water quality issues. And so we kind of approach this project with that holistic, let's look at both the water quality and quantity aspects. And can we get creative on the funding to accomplish both initiatives at the same time? So ultimately, we decided to kind of take let's step back, kind of look at what's happening, identify, what are the funding mechanisms that could be employed, what are the limitations, where are they applicable, some of those things to take a more comprehensive approach. One thing we do, I'm a researcher, I like to look at what's been done before. And, how do we kind of move to that next step? And a good way to do that is to look at other states or look at peers or aspirational peers that are facing similar issues and see if they've found, the magic solution, or are they doing things that we can learn from and implement here to improve the situation. So we decided to take that approach. We reviewed documents and information from websites of 10 peer or aspirational peer states, including Tennessee, trying to take a whole, nation approach. Let's look at what could benefit Tennessee, but, what are we doing compared to others? What are others doing that we can learn from? and maybe we can make some changes here. Um, so we reviewed documents and websites, but we also interviewed people to really kind of get to the information that's not available on the websites and documents. So a lot of times you learn a lot from doing interviews or surveys to provide context and arrive at information that you wouldn't have been able to achieve otherwise. Then we work to kind of synthesize and summarize the information. There's a report that has been submitted. We've shared it with TDEC, and they've got it. There's information that's being shared on multiple websites. If anybody wants kind of this presentation or otherwise, I'm happy to share that as well. But we've made some recommendations for what can be done in Tennessee. And working on trying to spread the word so that consultants and municipalities know what the options are for funding, what can be done, and also to advocate for increased access to funding or a creative use of funding to help achieve the goals of reducing stormwater issues in the state, having more projects that can be implemented to ultimately help with public health, safety, and welfare. I'll just give you a little overview on the interviews. We have to go through a process at the university when we involve human subjects through interviews and surveys to make sure we're not creating unnecessary risks to them and that the information is going to be protected if we're gathering any private HIPAA data or anything like that, personally identifiable information. So we went through all that before we performed any interviews. We identified key individuals from the websites and targeted an hour time slot. Some people we interviewed people that did everything from financial management on the grant side to program management and implementation on the project side for water quality, EPA, Clean Water Act regulations, and those things. And we, let them see the notes that we were taking. We recorded it, those interviews, so that we could validate the responses as we were trying to write everything up. We use a process that we had questions, but if the conversation evolved and we got into, interesting stuff that would be beneficial that we didn't anticipate, we allowed it to flow. And we really focused on some key issues. Originally, we were focusing on the Clean Water Act State Revolving Fund program, but realized that that was, just one drop in the bucket, one piece of the funding potential for some of these projects. Ultimately, we had 14 interviews from 10 states. Some people really were passionate and had a lot of information to share. And we had a couple of interviews that took 2 hours. So there was a lot of information gained from those. And it was interesting to see some people had been in the program and working on Clean Water Act issues and thinking about stormwater for decades, and then others were pretty new. You can see here, this is just a basic map showing where we had interviews. The smaller dots represent we had one interview. Larger dots represent multiple interviews, 2 interviews per state. Since we were kind of doing this, where does Tennessee fall in comparison? What can we learn? What are we doing well in comparison with other states? We looked also at years of experience, years working on Clean Water Act issues or state revolving funds, and staffing. So you can see from this, Tennessee's not, at the front or the end. We are falling somewhere in the middle. Okay, so the part that you're really here for is kind of thinking about the funding mechanisms that are available. And while we looked at a lot of funding mechanisms, and some states have some really creative approaches, I'm going to focus on the funding mechanisms that are applicable for us in Tennessee. So there's funding through TDEC, the State Water Infrastructure Grants Program. There's the OSG, the Overflow and Stormwater Reuse Grant, and that was presented on at the Stormwater Conference, the TNSA conference in Chattanooga in October of last year. And then the State Revolving Fund, which is a loan, and I'll talk more about these in a few moments. FEMA has funding that can be used for stormwater and flood management. So if you are treating, contain, treat, and then release, and you're thinking about the quantity, if you have some environmental water quality treatment in place as part of that, you're accomplishing Stormwater and Clean Water Act goals with releasing cleaner water that would have if it had been direct runoff. But you're also helping mitigate flooding. So there's 3 different funding mechanisms. I'll talk about these also in more detail. But there's the HMPG, the Hazard Mitigation Program grants, the BRIC, which last year BRIC was kind of canceled. It is back and open, and we'll talk about that briefly. And the flood mitigation assistance grants. If you didn't know, if your community is thinking about doing some development or doing community development block grants, you can also build in stormwater projects as part of that to help accomplish multiple objectives. And then the U.S. Department of Agriculture, most people don't think about USDA and stormwater, but the USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service agencies have some funding some funding mechanisms that are applicable to stormwater management. That's the Emergency Watershed Protection and Rehabilitation Program and the 319 non-point source pollution grants. There are some caveats and limitations on those, and we'll talk about those. Okay, first, Clean Water Act, because this is probably the most straightforward, direct consideration for stormwater project funding in Tennessee. It's just not been heavily utilized for stormwater projects to date. But in 2022, the EPA kind of lessened some of the requirements or took a more creative and open approach to interpretation of the Clean Water Act to allow consideration of resilience, including 2 threats, including climate change, and specifically included language referring to stormwater infrastructure projects. So in Tennessee, we can use and apply for state revolving fund, Clean Water Act state revolving fund loans to accomplish stormwater projects. The types of projects that are allowable are listed in the box in the blue on the right. There's another box with information about the Clean Water Act State Revolving Fund on the left. That's just an info sheet. So in Tennessee, you can apply for Clean Water Act State Revolving Fund loans, and it is a loan. It's a low interest rate, typically at or below market rates, with a 30-year term. There's principal forgiveness allowed for communities that meet certain criteria, such as 50 or below on the ability to pay index. And there's information on how to calculate that. Frequently, you also need to, if you're going to do an infrastructure project, you need to also perform some asset management planning or an assessment related to that. But you can also apply for funding to do planning, to do the design work, and to get technical assistance in doing the asset management work to apply for an actual construction project, like infrastructure project. So there's a lot of options. The planning and design loans are typically up to 5 years to develop the plans for construction. Then you can apply for another loan with that 30-year term to do the actual construction. Um, Principal forgiveness is interesting. There are some points. Projects are rated on a point system using a rubric. You can get points based on having green infrastructure, and in some cases, a green infrastructure project could potentially result in lower interest rates or principal forgiveness. So that's something to keep in mind when you're thinking about the types of project, whether it's green infrastructure or gray infrastructure or a combination of the two. In Tennessee, in the little white box that says projects eligible for funding on the left-hand side of the screen, those are projects that are eligible for funding in Tennessee based on our state's interpretation of the Clean Water Act SRF rules. But you can see you can do watershed protection, address non-point source pollution, the asset management's listed there. You can deal with water loss, stormwater management. Part of the Clean Water Act funding under SRF has historically focused on wastewater treatment and looking at CSOs and working to improve infrastructure on the wastewater side, but it's been broadened, and now, stormwater projects are available. One of the challenges is that we are not fully utilizing the funding that exists. So because it is a loan, the state gets some allocated funding from the federal government. And then there's also the repayment of prior loans that the state has those resources that can also be used. If you look at for FY23, and I know this information is a little bit out of date, there's money like over $600,000 that was state set aside that is not necessarily being utilized. There's money to be had here. And unfortunately, the call for proposals has passed for the most recent call. But this is something that happens on a regular annual basis. There will be a call for proposals for projects that will come out ideally in the fall of this year. So you should keep your eyes open for that. The sewer overflow and stormwater reuse grant that I mentioned earlier, the OSG, there's a maximum funding limit of $500,000 per project. There is some match requirement, but similar to the principle of forgiveness on the SRF funding, if you qualify for the principle, the API of 50 or less, or a population of less than 10,000, then you don't have to meet that match requirement. So this is an interesting situation because it is more limited in the amount of funding that's available, but I did want to at least mention it, make sure you all were aware about that funding mechanism. FEMA and TEMA, and the reason it's listed as FEMA and TEMA, many of the FEMA grants you have to go through TEMA as part of your application. You don't directly apply to FEMA, or you need the buy-in from TEMA to help with kind of pushing your application forward, making sure you've met all the requirements. And for part of the FEMA funding, there is it's not quite a match, but there is a portion that has to come from the local side, and TEMA, the state, covers a portion of that to help ensure that those funds can be fully leveraged, especially for communities that may not have the ability to secure the matching requirements. The flood mitigation assistance grants are open right now. It's from FY fiscal year 24. They've amended the know funding opportunity information, you can find that on FEMA's website. And those are due on August 6th. They do have a 25% local portion that is non-reimbursable. So that may have to come from your, utility fees or another source. And TEMA can help you with kind of working out what is needed on that. The Hazard Mitigation Program grants, the HMPG. This one's a little tricky, but again, there is money sitting, not being utilized, that could be utilized. We actually had some good conversations about this at the Tennessee Association of State Floodplain Managers panel earlier this week. It was a webinar. The HMPG grants do have a 25% match, but 12.5% of that is covered by the state. So for the local community, you only need to fund that other 12.5%. These are the HMPG program is based on its funding made available from federally declared disasters. And I don't know if you've been watching the news, but we've had several in the past decade, for better or worse. But there is a saying, don't let a good disaster go to waste. There's money that TEMA has. TEMA checked a box years ago somewhere that allows, if there's a disaster in one part of the state and the funding that comes cannot be fully utilized from that area, then TEMA gets whatever can't be utilized and can redistribute that across the state to help with mitigation projects. The challenge is that you need to know that, the project that you want to do is in your hazard mitigation plan. So everyone's homework from this is to go find your county hazard mitigation plan and look at projects that may be eligible to address stormwater and be eligible for HMPG funding. You cannot put in an application for funding under HMPG if the project is not listed in the hazard mitigation plan. The county or municipality can put in a pre-application that gets reviewed. Those are selected for funding, and then the whole process starts. Shannon Ball at TEMA is over the mitigation funding, and right now he's grown that office. There's a regional representative in each of the 3 main divisions of the state that can help you navigate the process. So as an example of this, if Nashville has in their hazard mitigation plan to put in a culvert in a certain place, like a larger culvert, or maybe they have, acquisition of homes that have had repetitive losses, just a very generic, project, in their hazard mitigation plan. If there's funds left from Waverly's flooding or Hurricane Helene flooding, and there are funds, there's funding based on what was shared even as recently as Tuesday. There is funding left from Helene that could be tapped into. So Nashville could apply and say, hey, we have this project, we've identified some homes for acquisition so that we can remove them from harm's way and, put that back into green space, help mitigate flooding. Then if TEMA and FEMA agree and all the paperwork is completed appropriately, then Nashville can tap into that funding. But if Nashville were to say, we want to elevate homes in this area, but nothing is in the hazard mitigation plan about elevation out of the floodplain, then that project's not an option. So being aware of what is in the local hazard mitigation plan is important, and working with your emergency management offices to make sure the projects that could help with stormwater and flooding, those types of issues, are in the plan for its next iteration. The plans are typically renewed every 5 years. So, and it's usually the local emergency management office leading that effort. So I'll get off the soapbox on that, but there are projects that could be built in to address stormwater that are also mitigating flooding that would be eligible if you work to make sure they were in those plans and then applied for the funding. BRIC is now back on the table and open. So the Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities this year, this round is focused less on planning and research and those things and more on shovel-ready projects. Hazard mitigation projects are listed, but there's a caveat when you go to the website and start reading that they are only eligible projects with at least a conceptual design are what is eligible. However, something to consider that you may want to think about is a lot of communities don't have stormwater fees, and maybe that's something that gets tied into codes. And codes adoption and enforcement is another category that's eligible under BRIC. We've not seen that be utilized for stormwater fees, and trying to create a mechanism to enforce stormwater or help establish stormwater utilities to date, but it could be eligible, and that might be something to consider. You can also use BRIC to elevate structures that are in the floodway. And there is a 25% local portion that's required on BRIC. And BRIC is interesting. It's challenging. There's $1 billion available right now, and the deadline's in July. So those regional mitigation specialists can also help you navigate that. If you're interested in that program for funding and want to submit an application. Under all of these, acquisition is a possibility under all of these funding mechanisms under FEMA. So thinking about for stormwater management, removing impervious area out of floodways to help mitigate flooding, but also improve water quality or create space for absorption of precipitation so you have less stormwater to manage and less runoff would be worth considering. But you have to adhere to the criteria. The U.S. Department of Agriculture and NRCS funding, there's multiple programs under the USDA. The 319 non-point source pollution grant funds is for project implementation. It is for doing the actual boots on the ground project. There's a caveat because a project to install or implement a BMP, a best management practice to help with non-point source pollution, must be included in a watershed-based plan. So there needs to be a watershed plan for the area that identifies the specific type of BMP that you want to implement. The challenge is that we don't have full coverage of watershed plans for the state. Several of us on the research side are working on watershed plans for different areas to try to help mitigate this and ensure that we do have coverage so that real implementation projects and improve water quality can take place. The 319 funds can be used for training, monitoring, and even education, but you still have to have the watershed plan in place even if it's not an infrastructure project. Historically, while using the 319 funds to develop watershed plans is a possibility. It's an eligible expense under 319. Historically in Tennessee, development of watershed plans under 319 funds has not been prioritized and has not really happened. What has happened is through another funding mechanisms, most of the watershed plans here have been developed through 604B grants. Those are planning grants. We just submitted one earlier this year. The timeline for those has closed. There is limited funding. This year, there was about $150,000 under the 604B program to develop one or more watershed plans for the state. That is U.S. Department of Agriculture funding that is passed through to TDEC, and then it is managed by the Tennessee Department of Agriculture. There is another funding mechanism under NRCS to develop watershed plans, and that's through the Mississippi River MRBI the Mississippi River Basin Initiative. NRCS can, our state office for NRCS can submit requests for funding to develop watershed plans, but it's only a rate of about 3 to 4 plans per year based on the amount of funding. So we need more watershed plans so we can do more implementation projects under the 319 program. And there is more funding in that for implementation than in the 604B or the MRBI program. So another homework piece would be to identify whether or not there are watershed plans in place for the areas that you're working. And if not, what would be needed and who could help develop those so that you can open up this 319 funding mechanism for implementation. I'll mention one other USDA funding mechanism, and it's the Emergency Watershed Protection Rehabilitation Program. This is kind of like a reimbursement. You can get technical and financial assistance for, different hazards and natural disasters, but flooding can trigger this. It does not require a federally declared disaster declaration, similar to the HMPG, but you can still apply for funding. It's just it needs to be an area that is being impacted by a natural disaster, windstorms, fire, floods that affect a watershed. That's the key piece. In both of these, you have to think about the watershed. And you can do different types of projects. I think these tend to be kind of the smaller projects. You can repair levees, reshape, stream banks, do some stream bank rehabilitation. You can use these to address, debris issues and stream channels, culverts, and such. But you can also address some drainage facilities, including stormwater drainage facilities. I have one example of this in some of the case studies. Nashville utilized this program, but there's strict timelines, and you have to document and keep receipts pretty meticulously to tap into that funding. So I've talked about Clean Water Act, several other funding mechanisms, but there's been some conversations happening here at the state about, what's eligible under Clean Water Act versus the SRF, versus the 319 program through USDA, and what can we do? Like, ultimately you want to optimize your opportunities for funding. So the EPA actually has had this question asked enough times that they have a chart um, where it kind of compares both funding mechanisms and also which ones are applicable to what can be done with either funding mechanism. And so I've highlighted here with little blue blocks is some of the things that are stormwater related that you could use either funding mechanisms for. Just keep in mind on the 319, you do need a watershed plan in place to be able to tap into the funds to do projects like those listed, like habitat protection and restoration, TMDL implementation, addressing urban runoff that's not part of a NPDES, NEPDES permit, erosion and sediment control, stream bank stabilization, those things. On the Clean Water Act side, TDEC has started to be more proactive and kind of thinking more about how do we really start addressing stormwater and utilize these funds more effectively. So I would surmise based on conversations and the recent call for proposals that they've had that, applying for stormwater projects under Clean Water Act SRF funding would potentially be a wise choice of your time or wise use of your time to try to secure funding through that if you can find the match or if you're in a community that would qualify for principal forgiveness. The 319 funds, you have to have the watershed plan in place. If you don't have a watershed plan in place, I'd recommend exploring the Clean Water Act SRF funds. Okay, so thinking about kind of going back to the states and thinking about where do we fall and how much funding is there. If you look at, if you look at where we compare to the other states, Ohio is, Ohio, Florida, and Illinois are in the lead. They are doing a ton of work and investing a lot in stormwater management. We are not too far behind, and there was an increase from fiscal year 24 to fiscal year 25. And if you look, our total for fiscal year 25 was around $60 million. That is a lot of money for wastewater and stormwater projects that is being allocated to the state. I'm going to spend a little time now that we've covered all the different funding mechanisms. Implementation becomes the real challenge. Like, how do we take all these funding mechanisms and really put it into practice so that we can start moving the needle and make a change? One of the challenges, and many of you know this, there's a lack of focus and interest by local communities when it comes to stormwater. So many communities don't understand why we need a stormwater utility, why we have to pay stormwater fees. It's water. It runs across the ground and seeps in and goes into rivers and streams. Why should we pay for that? Why do we need to manage that? But I think as we have this more intense precipitation that we're starting to see, it becomes a bigger issue. And we need to start being more proactive and talking about it. A lot of communities don't understand how many options there are to find funding to help with stormwater management. The SRF is a loan, so it's not free money like some of the others. Even the ones with a match, you're not repaying that. You're not paying interest. So I think a lot of communities do kind of steer away from applying for the SRF because they aren't sure if they can actually pay that loan back. So that is a challenge for many communities. But we also have, the SRF can be used for wastewater projects. And in some of the interviews, they said wastewater is our priority. We're not thinking about stormwater yet. We don't have the capacity to deal with stormwater because we have so many other issues to deal with. And I think that's across the board. Um, and, especially in rural communities, not having staffing and capacity and the buy-in to develop and implement a stormwater utility is challenging. Um, so it's hard to think about how do we pay back loans or invest in stormwater infrastructure or do an asset management plan when we don't, have money allocated for those types of activities. So it's just really challenging, especially in rural, small communities. And as we've seen for years, infrastructure that is not something you see every day, like power lines and roadways, the general public does not see the value in it. And they don't think about it until something breaks. I've got a few takeaways from the interviews I'll share here. When we were talking to the states, there's some states that, like I said, aren't considering stormwater. Some don't even think stormwater would be eligible under the Clean Water Act and state revolving fund rules. And then others have dedicated funding under that program just for stormwater projects. It's really hard when some states are thinking about whether or not the quantity of water can be managed or a component of stormwater. They're only focused on like nutrient loading or water quality without considering flooding. But the reality is, clean water or contaminated water, there is a quantity there that needs to be addressed. So you could be treating a small amount for water quality, or you could be treating a large amount. But there is water quality associated with any flood or runoff, the waters that are part of those. So treating for water quality could also help with mitigating localized flooding or downstream flooding if you're containing and treating. I should clarify that. Or allowing it to go through natural processes such as wetlands, and be detained for settling in settling basins or other mechanisms. Ohio has a unique situation where they have a sponsorship program where, if the main applicant for funding for a project wants to have a partner or do a smaller project that might be green infrastructure or something like that, the way it works, it's a loan to the main applicant, but there's a pass-through loan to cover that other project that is a mutually beneficial project, but it doesn't have the interest rate, the interest applied to it similar to the primary loan. So it acts more like a grant. So the larger project applicant becomes the sponsor for this like small grant project that's like a side project with beneficial purposes. Also, across the board, multiple states have principal forgiveness for what's called green project reserve projects. Those are the green infrastructure projects. So if you're doing green infrastructure projects, you can get a low or zero interest loan through the SRF program. And there's a lot of different projects. In some of the interviews, people mentioned street sweeping programs to help with water quality. One mentioned up in Maine, I believe, they were using state revolving fund loans to help with low impact logging equipment to reduce runoff or sediment loading in the runoff from forestry operations. And many states are using Clean Water Act funds to do planning. And that's where you can start establishing your local stormwater utility. You can do this asset management. You can do some of the initial design work for a project. There were some interesting approaches. In the interest of time, I'm not going to run through all this, but states have been combining funding from like the ARPA program and other funding mechanisms to kind of inject large amounts of funding to really make a difference, and kind of help boost some of their existing efforts. In some states, the planning grants have principal forgiveness. So it's like a grant, or planning projects, I should say, instead of grants. They act like a grant instead of a loan. Some states are trying to kind of borrow money and do bonding so that they have the full amount of funds regardless of how many projects come in, because they see the need to really start working hard to address stormwater issues. Planning funds have been used in Ohio to establish stormwater utilities. So that is something to keep in mind. If you don't have a stormwater utility, the SRF program might be a means to do the initial work to start that. Some key recommendations. A lot of communities that don't have stormwater utility fees, it's important to do the education and outreach and help citizens know why the stormwater utilities are needed. Also, on the back end of the grant management by the state, there was recommendations to be flexible and open-minded on the projects that come in. And some of this has been shared with TDEC, so they're also aware they are interested in funding stormwater projects. It's up to us in the community to actually submit the proposals to get those projects moving. Another recommendation, like I said earlier, it's been said, never let a good disaster go to waste. If you've had a major storm event in your community and you're wanting to start doing some stormwater infrastructure improvements or implement a stormwater utility fee, that is the right time to start having conversations to educate the community and say, look, this has happened. This is why we need stormwater management efforts in place. This is why we need a utility. This is why we need infrastructure to help manage the stormwater. Part of what we're trying to do is raise awareness and educate people across the board about the funding mechanisms and the opportunities. We did some case studies, and I am running short on time. I'm just going to quickly run through this and then we'll have questions. But we looked at multiple projects and creative solutions. The key takeaway on this is the projects that are successful are tapping into multiple funding mechanisms at the state, local, and federal level. It is not one grant for one project. And then, they're getting creative. Stormwater control and management requires a lot of partners, diverse funding. This is a case study from Resiliency in Hoboken, New Jersey. A key piece of this is they are holding 2 million gallons in a park. They have storage for 2 million gallons of water in a park that was previously an industrial site. Columbus has gotten creative. They have utilized local stormwater utilities to even put in sump pumps and rainwater detention systems, working with local residential households. So there's a lot of interesting projects if we get creative. The unique NRCS EWP reimbursement project that I mentioned that has happened in Nashville, where you need to be meticulous in keeping receipts and documenting. This was a project that Metro Water Services has done, and they utilize the EWP program and the 319 program. But there was a watershed plan in place that the Cumberland River Compact had helped develop that made the 319 funding possible. So I'd encourage you to think about both water quality and quantity when you're thinking about stormwater management, and explore the different funding opportunities to find what works best for your community. And let's take a more holistic approach. This is a summary. Like I said, I'm happy to share slides. Things to keep in mind is many of these funding mechanisms happen on an annual basis. Some of the timelines shift based on, continuing resolution at the federal level and other things that come into play. But BRIC is open right now. FEMA's hazard mitigation program is open right now. But if you wanted to plan ahead, you could start thinking about the timelines of when the grants are coming out and be prepared and watch for those notices so that you can hit the ground running to start putting together an application. Here's some additional resources, and I appreciate everyone that has taken time to show up today. Charlene will have the slides. I appreciate Charlene putting this together and having us. And my contact information's here. TDEC has weighed in and been heavily insightful as we were going through the process of the project and provided a lot of good feedback and input. We tapped into ARP funding to support the project, and Dr. Jen Pickering and Paulina Reyes Garcia are two of my colleagues that helped with the project. So I'll stop sharing and take any questions that you may have. Sorry. It's a lot of information to get in.
Thank God. Well, thankfully, if you send me those slides, I'll get those sent out to everyone along with their PDH certificate. But if you have any questions, you can just unmute and ask. Anyone? Going once? Going twice? All right, I guess I have no questions, but you guys can also email her all of your questions. I will send out her contact information and your PDH certificate and a link to the recording. I've been doing that right now.